ahead and go since no one will. So in response to the question, I, I would like to say for me, it's two things. The first is locating the source of the controversy, or in other words, as I'd like to say, the quote unquote pot stirrers. Critical race theory has been in existence for over 30 years, and all of a sudden it's at the forefront of people's minds. So knowing that, having that background knowledge, the first thing that comes to my mind is why all of a sudden. And so then that leads me to my second point which is what else is being advanced at the same time by anti-critical race theory people. And what I mean by that is, what other measures are CRT opponents putting forth as supposed solutions or alternatives? And how do these supposed solutions or alternatives actually support or advance or improve diversity, equity, and inclusion? My suspicion is that those solutions advance or alternatives do not. And in fact, opponents of critical race theory are, in my opinion, actually wanting to either hoard opportunities or justify the status quo of existing inequity.
And just echoing what Dr. Donner has said, I'm going to come at that from a counseling perspective. One of the things about critical race theory that people don't understand is that when you're talking about curriculum in public school, I think the misconception is that we are going to stand in front of a classroom and actually teach critical race theory, and that's not how you use a theory. We've been using theory for forever. The whole structure and the way in which we teach, the way in which we deliver instruction, the way in which we choose curriculum is all based on theoretical frameworks. But because of misinformation and just this hoarding of fear in an environment in which, let's face it, we've been through a lot, and people are afraid of what they don't know and afraid of change in some ways. And there's been so much that has happened. And so, from a psychological standpoint, this seems like yet another type of attack or something of that particular nature. And so, my concern with opponents of critical race theory is not their fear of critical race theory, but is their misunderstanding. And as we know, historically, misunderstanding leads to a whole other realm of possibilities as far as things going awry. And so I am quite pleased that we're having this conversation so that people can understand or have a better understanding of what it truly means to look at things from a perspective in which multiple lenses are being utilized in order to address the curriculum that is being presented, in order to provide the instruction, and to just have truthful conversation about what is it that you're truly afraid of, what is it that you are afraid will get out, what is it that you think your children are going to be fed, and being able to have that conversation so that all voices can be heard requires that you be able to open up your mind to be able to identify the facts. And so I appreciate this opportunity that you all have presented to have that opportunity to have a discussion.
And just to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Donner and Dr. Wallace-Alexander said, for me at the K through 12 level, CRT is really not our fight. Unfortunately, the level of misinformation has created a level of panic and kind of fear of something that has not been taught in Virginia's K through 12 schools. CRT really is not the issue in our K through 12 classrooms. The larger issue in our K through 12 classroom is telling the fullness of our American story. And that's one that deals with consequences and telling that fullness as part of our history. And part of our history was not, and isn't pretty. But as Americans, we're going to continue to struggle with history as long as a more balanced approach is not shared within the classroom. However, I do believe that in Virginia, with the Ed Equity VA providing a more balanced approach to it, it allows us to kind of educate ourselves more so what equity looks like in the classroom. But for me personally, I just don't believe at the K through 12 level, CRT is just really not our fight. It's just a lot of misinformation that's kind of been handed down. And because of fear with that misinformation, people are jumping to one side or another saying, hey, I don't want CRT in K through 12 classrooms, or I do want CRT in the K through 12 understanding. Both statements are made with a level of misunderstanding and not recognizing what that theory is.
Well, speaking of what that theory is, we had an amazing first question, which is, could the panel please define critical race theory for us? Which I think is fabulous. And there are lots of ways to do that. So if there, so any way you'd like to define it is great for our participants.
Since it's Dr. Donner's field of study, I'm going to defer to him to get the ball rolling.
Okay. So critical race theory is an amalgamation of critical perspectives that looks at the law's role in perpetuating inequalities, inequities along a continuum, not just strictly race, but class, disability, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender. And so with that, it really forces one to ask the question, why, particularly after the civil rights movement, why we haven't progressed it socially, racially, economically, as well as politically, like the ways in which we thought we should have post-civil rights movement. I'll stop there and give my colleague panelists opportunity to jump in.
This is my second or third conversation on CRT. I really like Dr. Donner's definition. The thing about critical race theory is that it forces us to look at the historical aspects that continue to plague us to this day. So when we look at education in particular, in the way that education was taught and who was offered education and how that impacted those individuals, critical race theory seeks to help us unpack the layers of what that looks like. So an example that I can tie specifically to Williamsburg would be, at one particular point in time, because of the push to desegregate, African-American schools, or schools that were for the Black students and then the other schools, instead of integration, they decided to close. And for those individuals on a socioeconomic level, as far as ethnicity is concerned, were unable to continue with their formal education in a school environment, where others who still suffered from the same thing, their schools being closed, but had resources in order to be able to engage in private schools outside of the area, were able to continue. The impact of that, of course, would be individuals who did not have or were not afforded the compulsory education that we normally see today of K through 12. And thus that would impact them being able to do other things later, such as advance to higher education. Generationally, that would impact the family, because as we know, education has always been a key or a springboard to other financial literacy and other opportunities, which would afford a better economic standing, better socioeconomic status, as well as other societal factors. And so right there, that's a perfect example of unpacking how that incident, that particular incident, had continued to play out from generation to generation among certain families, and how that impacted. And even after schools were integrated, then we saw that lots of African-American teachers, principals lost their jobs at the point of integration. And so then that thus impacts, because now you have this degree, you have established yourself as an educator, but now you're out of a job. And so many of those people, if you go back and interview them, those people took jobs as store clerks, janitors, and other things. And so again, impacting the socioeconomics of the family. And so that is a continuing legacy. that has to be addressed and dealt with, which is often not taught in class. So we see the part about, oh, civil rights movement, schools were integrated, now everything is great, but there's a whole nother impact behind that that is often either kept in the dark or not talked about, and how that has impacted where we are today, where we are seeing a deficit in the number of voices at the table of persons of color who go into education and are present in our schools and our school boards and our administration and school counseling. And so that is an important piece. And while nobody says, hey, that's about critical race theory, it really is what critical race theory is talking about in helping us to unpack the historical impact of how that one particular event has had that ripple effect on multiple aspects of education.
And I'm going to read a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was on MSNBC last month and was asked, what's a more basic definition for someone to understand CRT? And in the interview, she said, well, it's the study of law and how it has been a part of the infrastructure from slavery to emancipation to segregation to today, upon which racial inequalities have been based. It's basically an effort to think about, we have had commitments to equality since the 14th Amendment, yet our reach has not realized itself in real equality. So we're basically asking questions and looking at the way law has been a conduit for inequality, and therefore what we need to do about law in order to bring us closer to the dreams that we have as a society. And that was from Kimberly Crenshaw on June 21st from MSNBC. So that's the way I also see it, just from a more layman definition, so to speak.
Leah, if I can also add real quick before we get to the next question. One of the things I want to make clear is that when it comes to critical race theory, there's this perception that when we talk about race in general and critical race theory in particular, like somehow white people are not included or part of the conversation. And that is utterly false. One of the key founding members of critical race theory, Alan Freeman, was a white man, had an instrumental role in contributing to the intellectual trajectory of critical race theory. Also, there is a strand of thought dedicated to whiteness, critical whiteness study, which looks at the role in which, or tries to understand particularly why white people of lower SES status vote for policies and laws that are against their economic interests. So again, when we start thinking about critical race theory and wanting to debunk this myth and contradict some of the misinformation, we have to start with it's inclusive. Critical race theory is inclusive of everyone, white people included. And I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much. And I forgot to mention that question came from Martha Crockett. So thank you, Martha. Our next question is from Dion Kennedy, and it says, after this meeting, how do you imagine this information can be presented to the WJCC school board?
Well, I would hope, let me say this, I would hope that WJCC school board member would be present, but because it is a community conversation about critical race theory, and we know we've seen communities across the US at school board meetings react differently to what critical race theory is and what it is not. So as the village, we often go to the school board meetings, but really our mission is to educate the community, and that also includes WJCC school board because they are in fact a part of the community. So the goal is definitely share the information with school board members so they can be attuned to what's going on in the community and what how the community is being educated on topics that can be somewhat controversial.
It's my hope that in the past, when I was working in WJCC, and I didn't mention that I am actually a product of WJCC, having graduated from Lafayette along with Mr. Candidate, go Rams. Um, that it is my hope that they would be very involved. I hope somebody from the school board is actually in this particular meeting. My past experiences with the WJCC school board is that they're just like any other community. You have some that are going to be open and willing to listen. You have others not so much. But as a collective, when the facts are presented, obviously, then they have to have a conversation. And that's one thing about school boards, is that they can't just walk away from the conversation. Their whole mission or their whole duty as a school board is to join the conversation and listen to the concerns of the community. So it is my hope that this particular forum will be a springboard for more open and honest conversations with the school board.
And I would just, excuse me, I would just echo everything that's been said uh, by my fellow panelists in terms of, just having the conversation and pretty much airing out what are the genuine concerns that you have, and what are the ways in which we can begin to kind of work through those concerns and move forward.
Great answers. I'll also say that if you are interested in advocating to the school board, the village does that quite a bit. And if you want to learn more about that, you can come to one of our meetings, and we'll share with you our strategies and our beliefs about advocating to the school board. Next question is from Tara Taylor. Are there any corrective actions for teachers that may not want to teach CRT due to their own personal beliefs? Can parents remove their children from this learning? That is a permission slip needed?
So this is what I'll say as a K through 12 educator. CRT is not taught in public schools at K through 12 level. So it's not something that a teacher would need permission not to teach. We know as educators as a whole, we want what's best for all of our children. And what's best for all of our children is to provide a balanced approach to information when it's being presented to our children. It's not to persuade our children to think one way or another. We want all of our kids to think critical on any information that's presented. But it's definitely not something that's taught in the classroom. And I just want to go kind of a step further. There's a lot of words that's been tossed kind of under critical race theory, and equity, anti-racism, cultural competency, culturally responsive education, restorative justice, ethics studies. The list goes on, racial equality, education equity. Those words are part of what equity looks like in our schools, and we want equity in our schools, but they are not critical race theories. And I think that's part of the real reason why the village wanted to have this community conversation, to kind of clear up some things, not to be an organization that's for critical race theory or an organization that's against critical race theory. The purpose really is to just pass out, disseminate the information and say, hey, this is what critical race theory is, and this is what critical race theory is not. So it's not, and like I said, it's not something that's taught in our schools. The goal of Virginia, even the Ed Equity program that they're putting forth now, is really just to educate the teachers, so a teacher knows what cultural competency looks like. A teacher knows what the importance of cultural proficiency, those type of things, not so that the teacher can teach CRT. And I'll just repeat, CRT is not taught in our K through 12 public schools. And as someone who's studying critical race theory as part of his dissertation, I would not want it to be something that's taught. I teach elementary, I teach 5th grade. But we definitely want equity in the schools. And I just want to stress that equity is not critical race theory. And I think the media or whoever has done a great job at kind of rebranding or attempting to rebrand what critical race theory is. But I definitely think it's important to just get a clear understanding of what critical race theory is and what it is not. And then from there, you make an informed decision and choice on whatever path you want to take. But I don't think teachers don't need permission because it's not something that's taught. We teach history in a balanced approach. We know what Virginia requires as a highly qualified licensed educator in Virginia. We know what we have to teach. But I just want to make that point.
I found it interesting when people started with the whole conversation of, I don't want to teach critical race theory. And my first comment was, I don't want you teaching critical race theory either. Critical race theory is something that you, in order to teach it, you have to study it. You have to do that. And if you look at the blueprints for any of the subjects in Virginia, there's nothing in there about you teaching theory. Unless, you know, you're in a geometry teacher and you're teaching theorems or something, but there is nothing in there about you teaching critical race theory. And so I found it really interesting that people were all up in arms. Oh, I want permission slips and I want to pull my kids out of the teacher's class that teaches critical race theory. And I'm going, well, you're not going to be pulling anybody from anywhere because there is no teacher in K through 12 that's teaching critical race theory. Now, there may be a teacher who decides that they're going to put, you know, Sitting Bull, Malcolm X, and, you know, Georgia O'Keeffe all on the board, even though they're not in the, you know, maybe not one of the prescribed people to teach about, just because they want to teach something on a historical timeline. But again, you're placing on teachers something that is so much deeper than what it is that teachers actually do. And just like Mr. Candidate said, there is a difference between teaching theory, which they'll get theory when they go to college, if that's what they do. But being a highly qualified teacher means that you are able to take your content area and be able to situate it in the lives of the students so that they can make connections as to how the content relates to them. And that requires a particular type of skill that should be based or situated in equity, cultural competency, and an understanding of who your students are and their ability levels, so that no matter who you have in front of you, whatever their ability is, whatever other things they come into the classroom with, you are able to connect with them in all content areas. That is not critical race theory. That's called good teaching.
And I'll just kind of add my 2 cents. Just like Philip said, critical race theory is not taught in public schools. It's barely taught at the undergraduate level. Again, we're talking about a very high level, highly critical, highly analytical way of thinking that's taught in graduate school, specifically law school. As someone who actually teaches critical race theory at the collegiate level, my students will tell you, my class has 2 sections, one for undergraduates and one for graduate students. And my graduate students have to read law review articles in order to really remain true to the core of critical race theory. And so you have to understand law. You have to read law review articles that span anywhere from 60 pages to 90 pages. And so you tell me a public school teacher who's going to sit down and have their kids read a 90-page law review and then go ahead and deconstruct with them the laws that's based on, the various amendments. It's not going to happen. Again, it's a big lie. I'm just going to be that frank about it.
Great, thanks. We have another question. This one's from Adam Soldrich. He asks, with critical race theory being highly politicized, if you could, as a panelist, present before a political party and educate them about CRT, what points would you suggest to them, and how would you suggest these politicians present CRT from an educational standpoint rather than from a political standpoint, rather than politically driven? And he says, especially with the upcoming elections in Virginia for governor this November.
My first question would be, what truth are you afraid of revealing?
I'll just add to that. I know once the critical race theory controversy started, I've been public in saying I'm not debating anybody about the merits of critical race theory. It is what it is. Those who are against critical race theory, in my view, have their minds made up. They are not interested in having a genuine discussion of the ideas. Again, it's more so about creating a political boogeyman to create fear in white people, particularly to pass rules that will only perpetuate inequality and harm communities of color and traditionally underserved student populations.
You know, and I'll say, I'll kind of piggyback on what Dr. Donner just said. Unfortunately, the critical race theory, the media and the politics have already kind of attempted to redefine it. And in redefining it, it has created fear, and people are taking limited bits and pieces of the theory and then running away with bits and pieces. And any theory, there are going to be components of a theory that you agree with, and there are going to be components of a theory that you do not agree with. But in order to do either, you have to have an understanding of what that theory is. And unfortunately, those in politics, I question their level of knowledge on critical race theory, and whether they have any further knowledge other than a piece of soundbite they've gotten from somewhere. So for me, you know, just like we want our kids in our classrooms to think critically on information that's presented to them, I would hope that our political people in political positions would do more critical thinking versus just taking sound bites of information and kind of taking it and run with. You know, I do think our ed equity VA policy that's being put in place is a very good policy as it relates to equity in schools. But until we educate people on what critical race theory is and is not, you know, I think we're just going to continue to hear a lot of misinformation. People are not in error when they speak on critical race theory. They are just, I think some are genuinely okay with spreading misinformation. And there is a difference between being in error of something and spreading misinformation. And I do agree with Dr. Donner. It's not a debate, I think, I would be willing to get into with anyone. However, I'm more than willing to answer questions for if you genuinely want to understand what critical race theory is and how it is not taught in K through 12 schools. And if you believe it is taught in K through 12 public schools, I would just ask, what is your thinking, and give me examples so I can better educate you on what actually is being taught in the K through 12 schools.
Okay, we have a cluster of questions here that all have a similar theme, so I'm going to sort of summarize them. Eliza Trombetta asked, for the opponents who misunderstand CRT, what is their understanding? What do people who are anti-CRT think it is? Someone else who preferred to remain anonymous says, For those showing up to school boards as anti-CRT and against CRT, what are they in fact scared of their children learning about or not learning about? And then Laura Emery said, do you have any suggestions for what to say to diffuse those who are afraid of CRT beyond the statement that CRT is not being taught in our schools? So kind of similar, what are they afraid of and what do you say?
Well, I'm going to go to a conversation recently that someone brought up to me. I don't know if I just look friendly in grocery stores or what, but people come up and ask me very bizarre things. But one of the fears or that this particular individual expressed was, I don't want my child to, and this was, now I don't assume what people are. So I can only say they appear to be Caucasian. That's all I can say, because who knows? I have relatives that look Caucasian and they identify as Black. So I'm going to assume that this person, that was their thing. And so their question was, their statement was, I don't want my child to feel bad about being white. And I didn't quite know what that meant. So, I asked some questions. And that really kind of gave me a clue into one of the things, the misconceptions about critical race theory is that, we're going to teach that this one group is very bad and they've done all these bad things. And then this group over here has suffered because of all the bad things these people did to them. And I think that may be part of the problem. That's one of the things that people fear, is they don't want their children at school feeling bad. And so my statement basically was, one, consider the fact that you're in school and you look like me and everyone's telling you this one particular thing, this is what you are, this is where you came from. I was like, my whole group of people that I come from did not just start from slavery. They came from somewhere else and started, as kings and queens and scientists and all these other things. Is that being taught or is that being learned? I said, and then as far as your own child is concerned, nobody should feel bad at school. The whole point of equity and access that you're missing is that everybody's voice should be heard. The accomplishments of everyone should be heard. The contributions that everyone should be heard in an honest format. So historically, how did we get from point A to point B to point C? And where are we going in the future? And how is everybody's voice involved with that is what we should be looking at. So no, the whole point of critical race theory isn't to make one group feel bad or another group feel more. I said that is not the point of it. It's for everybody to be able to look at the same situation from multiple lenses and understand everybody's contribution to that situation, accomplishment, discovery, invention, the good and the bad of it, in an honest type format. That is the whole point. But the critical race theory's point is not to make any one group feel bad. That is not it. So if that's what you're afraid of, then that's not it. And then I repeated exactly what Mr. Kennedy and Dr. Donner have been saying. We don't teach critical race theory in school. We teach the curriculum that has been provided with multiple resources in order to connect that content to those students so that they can think critically. Your child should have enough information to critically think about the impact of actions so that certain aspects of history are not repeated.
And for me, I'll just repeat, CRT is not taught in schools. I think the fear is kind of what Dr. Wallace just alluded to as well, that all of a sudden your child is going to be blamed for history, and that's not the case at all. So the fear goes along with not knowing what other things are, that not knowing what it means to have restorative justice and to think, okay, hey, this is something that my child doesn't require. And if you're going to teach this, my child is going to be missing out on other opportunities. And so that's part of the fear when it comes to, critical race theory, when they're going to the school board. But all I can say is this: it's important to educate yourself on topics in the media that have been branded one way. Just educate yourself on a more balanced approach. When we teach a more balanced approach of history in the classroom, that is not critical race theory. And I think that's the part I really, really want to stress, is that it's not taught in the schools. And if anyone want to know, hey, I don't want my child learning critical race theory, my question would be is, what exactly is it that you don't want your child learning? Because I need to have an understanding of what you think your child is learning in order for me to respond appropriately. Because it's clear to me, anyone who comes to me and say, I don't want my child learning critical race theory in schools, my first thought is, well, they're not. But clearly the person has come to me with misinformation, already believing that their child is taught critical race theory in school or will be taught. So the person would need to educate me first. I am a firm believer in everybody knows something that I don't know. So I would ask that person to share with me what do they classify as critical race theory, and then I will be allowed to have a conversation with them. Because I think the biggest mistake many people make is to get into a debate with someone and you don't know where they're coming from on the topic.
I want to pick up on Dr. Wallace-Alexander's point regarding fear and kind of take it down another path. And I would make the argument that this fear, what's undergirding this fear are a couple of things. One being that being presented with the knowledge that since this country's founding, we have done a group of individuals, whether it be according to race, whether it be according to gender, whether it be according to sexual orientation, we've done them wrong. We continue to do them wrong. And so not wanting to face that is partially what's undergirding the fear. I would submit that the other piece undergirding the fear is that once it's acknowledged that we've done these groups wrong, we have to then atone for it, whether it be reparations, but we got to make people whole. Again, we have to then engage in equity, justice, restorative justice. And so I would make the argument that, again, this is kind of a old ruse, so to speak, where, again, it's deflection from really trying to prevent having the critical conversation. And if you kind of want to take this a step further and make it more localized, I would make the argument that's what's really what was pushing the UNC Chapel Hill fiasco regarding Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project. And so once it became possible to take that project and teach it, package it as a curriculum, history, whatever you may think of it in terms of quote unquote accuracy, okay, that's another debate. But once it became possible that that could be taught in schools, it's not a coincidence that the vitriol and the venom ratcheted up against her. And so my thing is, and if you've read the 1619, which I think is a fine piece of journalism, part of what she's also saying is not just the foundation upon which this country rests upon, but also we have to make people whole. And nobody ever wants to make people whole. And so again, if we've been taught for centuries that we're fair, merit, equality of opportunity, if we're finally taught that those are lies, then what do the people who have benefited from those lies have to stand on?
We got a clarifying question about restorative justice. So I don't know if Dr. Donner, you want to just respond to this. What does it mean? What does restorative justice mean?
I'm going to defer to my panelists first on that. I will admit I'm an expert in a lot of things. I don't pretend to be an expert in restorative justice. That's one area I'm still working and learning about.
And I just need 1 second here. My
Oh,
computer's glitching and I want to.
Oh, sorry, Philip.
You can go ahead, Dr. Wallace-Alexander.
So one of the things that we talk a lot about in my course, which is Multicultural Concepts and Perspectives, is about restorative justice, which can be defined multiple ways, but basically it is looking at how so let me give an example. If I have wronged you educationally, then what am I going to put in place to help you catch up, basically? So if you have been wronged, you have been denied. If you go back to the example I gave earlier, where I said the schools, rather than integrate, they chose to close the schools, which meant that people missed out on completing their education, graduating from high school, all of those things. Restorative justice then looks at how do you then go back and make rights of all those wrongs. And you're talking about multiple levels of wrong. So you're talking about how do you address their compulsory K through 12 education? How do you then make up for the limited opportunities of employment? How do you then make up for the limited opportunities to be able to gain access to higher education? And then how do you make up for the opportunities missed by generations that were impacted because people then tried to get on with their lives, they married, they had children, and then they still had to deal with those families with the limitations that for no reason of their own were placed upon them. And so restorative justice looks at how can you, through legal means, go back and right some of those particular wrongs. And that's probably the most layman terms that I could put that.
And from a K-12 perspective, when we see inequities that exist, and even if we look at the inequities in Virginia as a whole, so in the K-12 setting, African Americans make up about a little less than 18% of the student population. However, they make up anywhere between 46 and 58% of all suspensions. So that is inequity that exists. So we have to look at that through the lens of, okay, this inequity exists. Now, how do we make amends for this? What policies are we going to put in place to examine how can we better this if we have a population that only makes up 17%, but yet they make up 58% of short-term and long-term suspensions. So restorative justice will look at that and say, okay, how do we put things in place to right this wrong, so to speak?
And it's interesting that Mr. Kennedy brings that up, because one of the, as a restorative justice piece, one of the projects I worked on in Minnesota was about that. They then implemented in the school district that I was in. They looked at, and their population is even smaller than the one we have here. But they looked at the suspension rates and what the rates were for. And then they compared that data to other populations. Now, mind you, this didn't just affect African Americans. They have a large Hmong population there. They have some other populations that are African populations. They are first generation immigrants. And they looked at those populations and they looked at not just the suspension rates, but the expulsion rate. And so in order to bring about some restorative justice in that particular, they changed the way in which suspensions could be lobbied. So you could not do a suspension. And this was for everybody. You cannot do a suspension or put forth an expulsion without there being another step process. So you have the school that would make the recommendation, and then it would be reviewed by what we call central office. Central office before a decision would be made as to whether or not the suspension would hold, whether it would hold at that number of days, or whether the expulsion packet would be accepted. And so that began to tilt the balance of things. And so that's another educational restorative justice piece. Down the line, we will see restorative justice practices for things like the pipeline issue that we had. We'll see restorative justice things for, sadly, the Flint water crisis. And we are still seeing the need for some restorative justice going all the way back to Hurricane Katrina. So we do have multiple areas in which people are trying to put legislation in place or policies and practices in place that kind of level the playing field. They're looking at restorative justice with gentrification issues. So there are a lot of different ways in which restorative justice is coming into play from a political standpoint, from a legal standpoint, educational standpoint, and even in healthcare. It has been shown that certain populations were denied certain medical treatments, certain pain medications, certain aspects that other populations were given, particularly in the areas of recovering from childbirth, dealing with depression. And so there are some restorative justice pieces there that they are looking at being able to establish protocols and things in place that will bring about more equity and more equality in the way in which patients are dealt with for their mental and physical needs.
Thank you. We will go to another question about, so CRT is not being taught in schools, but what should be taught in schools is the sort of next topic. So Jody says, can the panelists provide an example of teaching that promotes equity, honors diversity, and acknowledges the full history of the US? I understand CRT itself is not being taught, but to what extent does it inform teaching approaches that lead to equity? Are there other approaches that are not based in CRT? Cheryl also says, asks, how well are we teaching our fuller American history now? African American history, which is all of our history, has largely been ignored in textbooks and teaching. To what degree is that being addressed? So current state of affairs in education and what to do next. What's a better way?
You know what has always baffled me about that question? Williamsburg probably has some of the best resource access. As a matter of fact, I have a book that I'm reading now by Martha McCartney about twin paths to freedom. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why the history within this book is not taught in WJCC classrooms. So I find that interesting. And so I guess to answer that question about what's taught in schools, well, what's taught in schools is voted on. Literally, your political vote decides what's taught in schools. So I'm very happy to see that there is an equity initiative, and I hope that we do move in the right direction to try to teach history a little bit better. I will say that having been a product of WJCC, coming from another state in which we learned a little bit differently, I will say, I was quite surprised by all the things that were left out or how they were explained when I arrived. But it is my hope that we will do a better job of teaching more fully, of really tapping into the resources around us. and having honest conversations starting very early on about, you know, what really was the life of Pocahontas like. It was not the Disney movie. Um, you know, what really happened at Jamestown and how were the settlers really received and how did they really treat the Native Americans? It would there's all this evidence and all these things that are there. I would like to see it taught that the Forest Glen area was always a place that had free blacks. I would like to see them teach about all the Native American tribes that are right there in the Toano area and their contributions to the area. The real story between Rockefeller when he came and miraculously made, you know, Duke of Gloucester Street, which used to be inhabited by African American businesses and homes, or, you know, how did Cheetah Mannix really become Cheetah Mannix and, you know, Camp Perry and places like that, to teach those particular histories, giving our children some connection to the area in which they live. But that's going to take the community requesting that that particular aspects of history are taught. That is not just the wonderful Colonial Williamsburg commercial that talks about how the West Africans and the Native Americans and the Europeans came and built this great nation. Well, one group did not come, and one group was already here. So so it would be really nice, but I think the community needs to understand you have to demand that your votes and who you put in office, who um, is in your school division, who goes to the VDOE, who writes your curriculum, all those things, they matter. Your small elections matter. You coming to things like this matter. You speaking to the school board matters. And so I think the community needs to understand, if you want a fair teaching of history, you're gonna have to demand it.
Yes, and to piggyback on Dr. Wallace, I agree with everything she said. And one of the things I will say that the village has been doing over the course of the last few years is we are taking oral history and oral stories from people who lived here in the community, so we can get those firsthand stories from voices you don't typically hear from the more commercialized part of our community. So we have those conversations with community members, and they can share what it was like here in Williamsburg, to get a better sense of local history. Local history becomes extremely important, even to our classroom teachers. We know that Williamsburg still largely is a very segregated community, by and large, but we do know that there is history here that comes before the story that's often told through the more commercialized aspect of it. And those histories are coming from the voices of lifelong residents. And those lifelong residents can give you their perspective of what it was like to live in Williamsburg or colonial Williamsburg during a time. And they tell their history on what it was like to have lost land, to be relocated to other things, and how that impacted. And we often think of things like this as, oh, that happened, you know, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And we lose sight of there are many residents here, you know, me being a lifelong resident. And, you know, my grandmother, who still lives, was born in 1929 in Williamsburg. And you know, my great grandmother was born in the 1800s. So it's not that long ago for someone like me who was raised by my grandmother and would visit my great grandmother regularly in the local community. So I think for our teachers, I think it is important for our teachers to be knowledgeable about the community in which they teach. And that way, in being educated on the local history, it allows you to establish connections to the community and families, and very often the students that you educate. But the ideal situation in Virginia is, I think the Ed Equity Report, DA, and I think Leah's going to drop it in chat. I would encourage everybody to take a look at the Ed Equity VA report. It talks about the things that teachers would need to do, things that our leaders, our educational leaders need to do to find out what's being taught in our Virginia schools. But I think that's a great place to start, to educate yourselves as far as what's going on. We know this coming year for the first time that African American history will be taught in our schools. So that is an option that's going to be there as well. So things are changing. And it's important to educate yourself on those things. Attend school board meetings like Dr. Wallace-Alexander said, have those conversations with school leaders. And, be a part of the change and not one who just fights against the change, but don't offer, any new ideas on how to make things better. It is the one thing the village have come to realize. It is definitely a marathon. It's not a sprint. Change takes time, but it takes a consistent advocacy for that change to occur. So we definitely want the equity in the schools. And I hope through everything I said, Leah, I did answer that person's question. So I hope I did answer that question.
And I also want to add that Williamsburg, James City County has, I know when I was in Williamsburg, James City County teaching, I was really happy to work with my minority achievement leaders. I see Kay Cheeves is up here. And so please understand that the whole, when Mr. Kennedy said this is a marathon, this marathon's been going on for a while, and there have been many a dedicated person, like people like Kay Cheese, people like Linda Bird Pollard, people like that. The candidates have been in this, they've been in this fight for a long time and trying to get that word out there. And so because of those efforts, that is why we have made some progress. And so it is really good to see that there are people still trying to move the progress forward, helping people to understand everybody needs a voice at the table. And if we're going to tell it honestly, it's going to require some work to get that out there.
So speaking of that work, we have a couple questions about the school board. School board was mentioned a couple times. That's one of the things that the village does, is go to the school board and say our piece at the public comment section. And I know the village has been doing that since about 2016. So, and now they're starting to put equity, on in their conversations. So little bits of change are happening. We got a question from Mike Hatfield asking if we might be able to recap the discussion about equity and CRT at the recent WJCC school board meeting. So basically what happened. And we'll start with that. Maybe Philip wants to recap unless somebody else knows a little bit more.
So just repeat what you said again, Leah. I'm sorry.
So no, that's okay. But basically what happened at the school board meeting the past couple times about CRT?
Well, I think what you are seeing today is kind of the result of what happened at the school board. Really the goal is just to share information on critical race theory and give the community opportunity to answer questions. And we decided to do this because of so much misinformation that was being circulated. And that misinformation was not only being circulated at school board meetings. We started to notice that within the community, there were community Facebook pages and other things through social media popping up with the same type of misinformation. So, you know, for us, when we went to the school board meeting focusing on WJCC's strategic plan, one of the things that's in Williamsburg-James City County strategic plan, I do believe is goal number 2, was equity in our schools. So we just went there to stress the importance of equity and try to give information on what equity is. But really, what happened, like I said, what happened at the school board meeting kind of led to us having this meeting, kind of sharing the importance of getting information out there, what critical race theory is and what it is not, from a balanced approach. And like I said, the village where we stand, we are here to disseminate the information on critical race theory, not to say that we are for critical race theory or against critical race theory. We are just here to educate the community and allow community to ask questions in relation to critical race theory.
Another question about making change here. How can we ever level the educational playing field as long as our public school funding is based on property taxes?
I would say therein lies a $64,000 question, because, you know, as a former, soon to be former homeowner, you know, for some individuals, where they choose to buy a home is you know, there's so much wrapped into that, you know, whether it be socioeconomic status, issues around prestige, aspirations. Schools are one part of that. And so I think with that inextricable link with housing and schools, where if I'm choosing to live here, my liberty, my right, you know, you begin to weave in all these social narratives and stock stories. And so, well, if I'm paying my taxes, as if, you know, people who don't own a home in a particular community don't pay taxes. So it's very hard to really have that conversation because so much is wrapped up in it that it becomes too personal for a lot of people. And so when you begin to really push that conversation about how do we address inequity, how do we begin to mitigate inequality from a systemic standpoint, people, it's almost like a trigger for some people.
Well, you know, Leah, one of the things the village has often advocated for was a change in the funding scenario. We recognize that some schools, as wealthy as our community is, and I think I said this earlier, we still have a segregated community. We still have a community that's based on the haves and have-nots. So with that said, you know, we have two elementary schools in WJCC that are 100% free and reduced lunch. And with 100% free and qualified one, and I think that's Matthew Whaley and James River. With that comes greater needs than, say, a school that has a free and reduced population of 25 or 30%. So the idea that a school like a Blue Ribbon Elementary School, because we do have a Blue Ribbon Elementary School here, and so like a school, I don't want to call out the school, so I'm trying to be very politically correct here. So a Blue Ribbon School that's on the side of town, and much the kids that are zoned for that school comes from more of our affluent neighborhoods. You know, it's nothing for their PTA to raise $30,000 a year and then you look at another school that's on the other end of the county where a large population or the population is 100% free and reduced lunch, you know, those schools are not going to have the same needs. They're not going to have the same needs. A school that's typically 100% free and reduced lunch, you know, I would like to see, or we as a community would hope that more counselors are provided there. That school that I'm talking about in particular has a larger ESL population. So obviously we're going to need more EL teachers at that school. So you can't automatically say, you know what, we have 9 elementary schools and we're going to give all 9 elementary schools $20 a piece. Of course, I'm just kind of throwing out a number, and expect all 9 schools to excel at the same way when the needs are very, very different in those schools. So we have to look at more of a school needs-based funding. When we look at that, you know, we look at the high schools, and with that need-based funding, a lot of other factors come in. We know even when we look at the high schools and we look at AP classes, we know in Williamsburg, James City County, one school in particular has far more AP classes, offer far more AP classes than another high school. How do we get a more balanced approach to that? And of course, me now, I'm thinking, you know, with the whole virtual, I'm hoping that kind of opens up more AP classes so they can't say, well, this school had more students and this school didn't have enough. It makes it more accessible to all. But when it comes to funding, I think it's very important that we as a community look at the data. The data will give you startling results on the needs of our schools. The one thing we have always said, we will be a school division that's pretty much always 100% accredited. But when you look at the data and break the data down into subgroups, then it tells a very, very different story. You can look at the schools that struggle to meet. You can look at those schools that have these wide achievement gaps in them, and how do we address them? The only way we're going to be able to address them is to provide more services and more funding to those schools. And what I mean by that, I do not mean take away funding from another school, because that's often a fear that we also often hear, that if you give money to this school, you're taking away opportunities for my child at this school. That is not what I am saying. That's not what I'm saying at all. But as a community, we have to look at the greater good on what we can do to make our community as a whole a better community. You will always hear me say, Williamsburg, James City County has good schools. You know, we don't have great schools. We won't have those great schools until we recognize the inequalities that exist in our schools and how we can better serve the needs that the data drives us to say, hey, this school does require more. So definitely school-based funding is something that I think as a community, we need to look at.
Okay, we're coming up on the last 10 minutes of our time. I wanted to ask if Amy or Jennifer or Jackie wanted to ask any questions or to say anything about what the village is doing, or some of the things that they're working on that may be pertinent to this discussion. Otherwise, I can just have more questions. There's tons.
Well, I think it's important to add, I know earlier I said that folks should visit our website to see the work that we're doing. It is important to add that we are highlighting those voices and the voices that have not been heard in our community. We partnered with the College of William and Mary and the local schools to create a curriculum of local African-American history to be taught in WJCC schools. And we started on that journey prior to the governor mandating anything about teaching Black history. So we are very proud of that. and proud of this community for coming together with us to do it. The elders that have sat and given their stories and given their histories, and the families that are sharing the histories and photographs and newspaper articles. And we're going to have a website that it will be dedicated to that. We have formed an African American advisory board that will oversee this entire process so that the descendant community will tell our story. And I think it's very important and groundbreaking. We started out as an educational equity organization devoted to educational equity in WJCC schools through mentoring, tutoring, and advocacy. The village has met each one of those tenets head on. We've been able to accomplish some amazing things, but I thought it was important, since we are here tonight, that folks in this community know that we are dedicated to elevating the voices of those that have not been heard. We see that there is still a need. We talked about long. The question is always, it's been a long time coming. How long? There's a sense of urgency right now for our children, the African-American children and children of color. There's a sense of urgency. And we talk a lot about initiatives and conversations and all of that. I'm so happy to work with the village and these panelists who are here tonight, because you are doers. You are doers and doing the work to move us forward. And that is what we need to have happen. So again, we thank you guys and thank everyone for joining us. I'm not a CRT. I don't study it, I don't teach it, but I have made it my business to find out what it is, to listen, to read, and listen to the folks that are here tonight. And I'm clear on the fact that there is no struggle or fight for us to be going to WJCC school board meeting, using up the time to fight about critical race theory, which is not taught in our schools. But we do have a whole lot of other things on the table that we continue to address and face. We are over 50 years out of integration, and we're still having the same conversations. We met with the Bruton Heights class of 1965. We had an amazing filming with them. If you go to our website, you can see that. And they talked about the community. And you know what was so important to them? The teachers from their community. So that's one of the things that we can plug back in, is bringing in some teachers from the community. When people lose their culture, their teachers, their community, there's a huge loss. There's a void. And that's a void that children of color are experiencing, and we need to address that. And I know there's folks here tonight who have never been to a village meeting. So I just want to make it my business and make it be clear who the village is, because I know there's people from all sides and all walks of life in here. We are a nonpartisan organization. We are a 501(c), and we are about equity and educational equity and justice. We fight against injustice in the school to prison pipeline, and we want to make sure that we don't believe in critical race theory being taught. We don't have a view on that. So I want to make sure that we know that. But I will say this: we know that there was slavery. There was Reconstruction. There was the Civil Rights era. There was the Jim Crow era. There's the era that we live in now. And in every single one of those eras, there's been some errors when it comes to people of color. So we need to be clear about that. And we want to make an effort to move forward. But again, how long? How long? And that's my piece. I'm done. I'm Jacqueline Bridgeforth Williams, and I'm done. Amy or Jen, did you want to share anything about our initiatives with the ESL and the ELL students and the work that the village and you especially, and Catherine Barco Alva, have been able to accomplish with those students and their families?
No one should ever follow Jackie. All I'll say is come check out our website, come to our meetings. All are welcome, right, at our meetings. And yeah, come check us out, because the village has been here doing the work, as Jackie said.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we had quite a few questions in the chat about, what's next, what's the village going to do after this conversation, and all of that gets talked about in our meetings. This recording will be available for everybody. We're planning on sending it to the school board and that sort of thing, but the real work is getting together, right? The village gets together every other week, or no, it's second and fourth Mondays, actually, not technically every other week. And we talk through this. What are we going to do next? What's the next step? How do we make a difference? And then we rally everybody and we go do it. And that's what we're going to do next. So if you want to join us, come to our website, villagewjcc.org. There's a little meetings tab, and you can email us at villagewjcc@gmail.com to ask to be added to our email list. And I believe I put that email address in the chat already, but someone else can do that for me while I'm saying the next thing, which is that I just wanted to give, we have about 4 minutes left. If anyone on the panel wants to make a closing remark or leave us with a little bit of wisdom, that would be lovely.
Well, I'm not going to do either one of those things. I'm not going to leave you any wisdom or closing remarks, but I do want to say this. If anyone who typed a question in and their question was not answered, please feel free to shoot us an email, and we'll definitely address it. We'll address it at our next village meeting. We want to make sure we give you the opportunity to get your question answered, and maybe it was a question that someone else was thinking of and they didn't type it in. So definitely, if you have a question that was not answered, definitely send us an email so we can answer that question. But I do want to thank everyone definitely for coming this evening. We thought this conversation was extremely important to be had in our community, given what's going on in our community and beyond. And the hope is that you have gotten a nugget of information this evening that you can walk away from saying, okay, I didn't know this, but now I have at least this understanding of what critical race theory is. And just take that information and share it. Any new knowledge that you obtained this evening, my ask would be that you share that new information, knowledge with a friend or neighbor or someone else, just to better our community as a whole.
Real quick, I want to thank the village for the opportunity to speak tonight. And my parting gift would be just to read, and read some more.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always nice to, so to speak, come home. I can't see everybody who's on here, but anybody that I missed, hello. And just continue to know that there are people who care about this community. Work with the people who are doing the work. You don't have to sit out there just with your questions. There are people here. So I'm really excited to see this. And I wish everyone well as you continue to bring equity and access to WJCC. There's a lot of wonderfulness there. So don't let that get lost on the rhetoric.
Absolutely.
So with that, have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much. And thank you all again. My heart is just, it feels so good. This was an amazing conversation. Panelists, thank you. You all were absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. And we invite you to come back and speak to the group, come back and visit the meetings. We just invite you to come back. And all of the guests who are here this evening, we hope that you learned something from these amazing panelists. And also, if you have any questions or concerns, you can go to our website, you can email us. If there's a question that didn't get answered, email us, we'll get it to the panelists. And who knows, we may have them come back because they are just absolutely amazing. Thank you all. Thank you so much.